The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Bellevue Palace as President Frank-Walter Steinmeier stood at his office window, watching the final preparations for his departure to London. The invitation from King Charles III had arrived 3 weeks earlier, written on cream-colored paper with the royal seal pressed deep into the wax. It was not just any invitation. It was a summons to one of the most significant diplomatic receptions of the year, marking a new chapter in British-German relations following the coronation. Steinmeier's aide, Klaus Müller, entered the office carrying a thick briefing folder. The president turned from the window, his silver hair catching the morning light. At 70 years old, he had seen many diplomatic events, but this reception promised to be different. The political landscape of Europe had shifted dramatically over the past few years, and every gesture between world leaders now carried weight that extended far beyond simple courtesy. "The final security briefing, Mr. President," Klaus said, placing the folder on the polished oak desk. "The British have been quite thorough in their arrangements." Steinmeier nodded, opening the folder to reveal detailed floor plans of Buckingham Palace, guest lists, and protocol schedules. His eyes scanned the names of other world leaders who would attend. French President Emmanuel Macron, Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, Spanish King Felipe VI, and dozens of other European dignitaries. Each name represented a conversation that could shape the future of the continent. The president's mind drifted to his last meeting with King Charles, then still Prince of Wales, during a climate summit in Berlin 2 years earlier. They had spoken for nearly an hour about environmental initiatives and the role of monarchy in modern democracy. Charles had impressed him with his genuine passion for sustainable development and his deep understanding of European politics. Now, as king, Charles was hosting his first major diplomatic reception, and the symbolism was not lost on anyone. Steinmeier's wife, Elke Budenbender, appeared in the doorway. A respected judge in her own right, she had been his partner through every step of his political career, from his early days as chief of staff to Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder to his current role as federal president. Her presence at such events was always a source of strength for him. "Are you ready for London?" she asked, settling into one of the leather chairs facing his desk. "As ready as one can be for an event that might reshape European diplomacy," Steinmeier replied, closing the briefing folder. "The king has planned something special. According to the British ambassador, this reception is designed to establish new traditions for his reign." The phone on his desk buzzed softly. Klaus answered, listened briefly, then turned to the president. "The motorcade is ready, sir. We should depart for the airport within the hour." Steinmeier stood and walked to a portrait of former President Richard von Weizsäcker hanging on the wall. Von Weizsäcker had been his role model, a leader who understood that the German presidency was about more than ceremony. It was about being the moral voice of the nation and its bridge to the world. Today's journey to London would test those principles. The flight to London was smooth, giving Steinmeier time to review his notes and prepare for the various conversations he would have during the reception. The German delegation included Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock, several key ambassadors, and cultural representatives. Each had their own agenda for the evening, but all understood that the president's interactions would set the tone for Germany's relationship with the new British monarch. As the plane descended toward Heathrow Airport, Steinmeier could see the sprawling city below, its ancient history intertwined with modern challenges. London had always held a special place in his heart. He had studied there as a young man, walking the same streets where Churchill had rallied Britain during its darkest hours and where Margaret Thatcher had redefined conservatism. Now he was returning as the head of state of Germany's democratic republic, a nation that had overcome its own dark past to become a cornerstone of European unity. The British protocol was flawless from the moment they landed. A small convoy of Rolls-Royce vehicles waited on the tarmac, their diplomatic flags fluttering in the afternoon breeze. The German ambassador to the United Kingdom, Miguel Berger, stood ready to escort them through London's traffic to their accommodations at Claridge's Hotel, where visiting heads of state traditionally stayed during such occasions. During the drive through London, Steinmeier observed the city's rhythm. Despite the economic challenges facing Britain after Brexit, the capital maintained its vibrant energy. Street artists performed near Piccadilly Circus, business people hurried along sidewalks with their phones pressed to their ears, and tourists gathered around the gates of Buckingham Palace, hopping for a glimpse of royalty. The king has requested private audiences with several heads of state before the main reception, Ambassador Berger explained as they passed Hyde Park. Your meeting is scheduled for 6 o'clock this evening, just before the formal gathering begins. Steinmeier nodded, understanding the significance. Private audiences were rare and indicated that King Charles wanted to establish personal relationships with key European leaders. The topics they would discuss could influence British foreign policy for years to come. At Claridge's, the German delegation was shown to a suite of rooms that had hosted world leaders for over a century. Steinmeier's suite overlooked Brook Street, where traffic moved in the familiar London pattern of controlled chaos. He had 2 hours to prepare for what might be the most important diplomatic conversation of his presidency. His preparation routine had remained unchanged for decades. First, he reviewed key policy positions and recent developments in German-British relations. Trade agreements, security cooperation, climate initiatives, and cultural exchanges all would likely come up during his audience with the king. Second, he considered the personal aspects of diplomacy, the human connections that often mattered more than formal negotiations. Elk helped him select his formal attire for the evening. Protocol demanded white tie and decorations, and tradition that connected modern diplomacy to centuries of royal ceremony. As he adjusted his bow tie, Steinmeier reflected on how these formal rituals served a deeper purpose. They created a space where normal political calculations were suspended, allowing for more honest communication between leaders. The drive to Buckingham Palace took them through streets lined with British flags and curious onlookers. News crews had positioned themselves at strategic locations, knowing that the images captured tonight would appear in newspapers and broadcasts around the world. The reception was being treated as a significant moment in King Charles' early reign, a test of his ability to conduct the soft diplomacy that had been his mother's greatest strength. At the palace gates, security was tight but discreet. The German motorcade was waved through after brief document checks, and they proceeded up the tree-lined drive to the palace entrance. The building itself seemed to glow in the early evening light, its Portland stone facade representing centuries of British history and continuity. As Steinmeier stepped from his vehicle, he was struck by the palace's grandeur and the weight of tradition it represented. Every stone told a story of empire and evolution, of a monarchy that had adapted to survive in the modern world. Tonight, he would become part of that ongoing story. The palace staff moved with practiced efficiency, guiding the German delegation through marble corridors adorned with priceless artwork. Portraits of kings and queens watched from gilded frames as they made their way to the blue drawing room, where King Charles would receive his guests before the main reception. Steinmeier paused for a moment before entering, taking a deep breath and centering himself for the conversation ahead. Through the palace windows, he could see the gardens where the reception would take place, already being prepared with tables, lighting, and floral arrangements that would create the perfect backdrop for diplomatic history. The double doors opened, and a palace official announced, "His Excellency the President of the Federal Republic of Germany." As Steinmeier stepped into the room, he saw King Charles III standing near a magnificent fireplace, wearing the formal uniform of Colonel-in-Chief of the Parachute Regiment. The king's expression was warm but serious, befitting a monarch who understood the gravity of the moment. "Mr. President," King Charles said, extending his hand, "welcome to Buckingham Palace. I'm delighted you could join us for this reception." The handshake was firm, and Steinmeier could see intelligence and purpose in the king's eyes. This would not be a ceremonial conversation, but a substantive exchange between two leaders who understood their responsibilities to their nations and to Europe as a whole. As they settled into chairs arranged near the fireplace, Steinmeier realized that the next few hours would likely influence the direction of European politics for years to come. The reception was more than a social gathering. It was King Charles' first major statement about Britain's role in the post-Brexit world and its relationship with continental Europe. The conversation that followed would test both men's diplomatic skills and their ability to find common ground on issues ranging from climate change to security cooperation. Outside, guests were beginning to arrive for the main reception, but inside this elegant room, two of Europe's most important leaders prepared to shape the future of their continent through the ancient art of personal diplomacy. Through the tall windows, the last rays of sunlight illuminated the palace gardens, where hundreds of guests would soon gather for an evening that promised to be remembered as a turning point in British-European relations. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the drama of international diplomacy was about to unfold in one of the world's most famous royal residences. King Charles gestured toward a pair of ornate chairs positioned near tall windows overlooking the palace gardens. The blue drawing room, with its silk-covered walls and crystal chandeliers, provided an intimate setting for their private conversation. Steinmeier could hear the distant sounds of preparation as staff arranged the gardens for the evening reception, but his focus was entirely on the monarch sitting across from him. "I wanted to speak with you privately before we join the others," King Charles began, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to weighty conversations. "The relationship between Britain and Germany has always been complex, but I believe we're entering a period where that relationship could define the future of Europe." Steinmeier leaned forward slightly, recognizing the significance of the king's opening words. In diplomatic circles, such direct statements at the beginning of a meeting usually indicated that substantive discussions would follow. "Your Majesty, Germany has always valued its partnership with Britain. Despite the changes brought by Brexit, we see opportunities to strengthen our cooperation in new ways." The king nodded thoughtfully. "Climate change, for instance. You know my passion for environmental issues goes back decades. I've watched Germany's energy transition with great interest. The challenges you've faced, the successes you've achieved, there's much Britain could learn from your experience." This was familiar territory for Steinmeier. Germany's Energiewende, the transition to renewable energy, had been one of the most ambitious environmental projects in modern history. It had faced criticism, experienced setbacks, but ultimately demonstrated that a major industrial nation could reduce its carbon footprint while maintaining economic prosperity. "The transition hasn't been without difficulties," Steinmeier admitted. "We've learned that public support is crucial. People need to understand not just the environmental benefits, but the economic opportunities that come with renewable energy. We've created hundreds of thousands of jobs in wind and solar power." King Charles showed genuine interest, asking detailed questions about wind farm development in the North Sea and solar energy initiatives in Bavaria. The conversation revealed his deep understanding of environmental science and his frustration with the slow pace of global action on climate change. For nearly 20 minutes, they discussed technical aspects of energy policy with the intensity of two engineers solving a complex problem. "I've been thinking about how the monarchy can support these initiatives," King Charles said. "Not through politics, of course, but through example and encouragement. The royal estates could become showcases for sustainable agriculture and renewable energy." Steinmeier saw an opportunity to strengthen ties between their nations. "Perhaps we could arrange exchanges between German renewable energy companies and British research institutions. Your support would carry enormous weight with both governments and private industry." As their environmental discussion continued, a palace aide discreetly entered the room and whispered something to King Charles. The king nodded and turned back to Steinmeier. "President Macron has arrived. I'll need to see him briefly, but I hope we can continue our conversation during the reception." The private audience had lasted 45 minutes, longer than initially scheduled. Steinmeier understood this as a positive sign. The king had been genuinely engaged in their discussion. As he was escorted to a waiting area, he reflected on what he had learned about Britain's new monarch. King Charles was serious, well-informed, and clearly interested in using his position to influence global environmental policy. The grand entrance hall filled with the sounds of arriving guests as Steinmeier waited with other heads of state for the reception to begin. President Macron emerged from his audience with King Charles, followed shortly by Prime Minister Meloni. Brief nods and polite greetings were exchanged, but the formal protocol of such events limited conversation until the main gathering commenced. At precisely 8 o'clock, the palace doors opened to the gardens, and guests began moving outside. The transformation was remarkable. What had been a construction site of tables and equipment an hour earlier was now an elegant outdoor ballroom. Hundreds of lights twinkled among the trees, string quartets played classical music from discreet locations, and uniformed staff circulated with champagne and canapés. The guest list read like a who's who of European leadership. Beyond the heads of state, there were foreign ministers, European Union officials, business leaders, cultural figures, and representatives from major international organizations. Each conversation at such gatherings could influence policy decisions affecting millions of people. Steinmeier found himself in conversation with Queen Maxima of the Netherlands, discussing refugee integration programs. Her background as an Argentine-born economist gave her unique perspectives on immigration policy that resonated with Germany's recent experiences. They were joined by the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, who shared Denmark's innovative approaches to renewable energy development. The key is making environmental policy economically attractive, Queen Maxima observed. If green technologies create jobs and reduce costs, public support follows naturally. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, whose presence at the reception carried special significance. Britain and Germany had been among Ukraine's strongest supporters since the Russian invasion, and Zelensky's attendance demonstrated that European unity remained strong despite ongoing challenges. Steinmeier had spoken with Zelensky many times over the past year, but tonight's conversation felt different. Standing in the gardens of Buckingham Palace, surrounded by the leaders of democratic Europe, the Ukrainian president seemed to embody both the fragility and resilience of European values. "The support from Germany has been vital," Zelensky said, speaking in fluent English. "Not just military aid, but the willingness to accept Ukrainian refugees to share the burden of this crisis." "Democracy requires solidarity," Steinmeier replied. "When one of us is threatened, we all must respond. Germany learned this lesson from history." King Charles approached their group, having worked his way through various clusters of guests. The skill with which he managed the reception was evident. Each conversation seemed natural and unhurried, yet he was clearly following a carefully planned route through the crowd. "Mr. President, I hope you're enjoying the gardens," King Charles said to Steinmeier. "I wanted to introduce you to someone I think you'll find interesting." He gestured toward a woman in her 50s approaching their group. "Dr. Sarah Richardson leads our new Institute for Climate Diplomacy. She's been studying Germany's energy policies extensively." Dr. Richardson proved to be exceptionally well-informed about German renewable energy initiatives. Her questions were precise, and her observations insightful, revealing months of careful research. As they talked, Steinmeier realized that King Charles was orchestrating connections that could lead to concrete cooperation between British and German institutions. The evening's carefully choreographed conversations continued as guests moved through the gardens. Steinmeier found himself discussing trade relations with the British Chancellor of the Exchequer, cultural exchanges with the director of the British Museum, and security cooperation with the head of MI6. Each conversation was brief, but substantive, covering topics that would normally require formal meetings and extensive preparation. As the reception reached its midpoint, King Charles called for attention and delivered brief remarks. Standing on a small platform beneath ancient oak trees, he spoke about the importance of European cooperation in facing global challenges. His words were carefully chosen to avoid political controversy while emphasizing shared values and common goals. "Tonight brings together leaders who understand that our challenges transcend national borders," the king said. "Climate change, economic inequality, threats to democracy, these issues require us to work together with unprecedented cooperation and mutual respect." The applause was warm and sustained. Even in an age of political cynicism, the symbolic power of monarchy to unite people around common purposes remained strong. Steinmeier found himself moved by the king's sincerity and his obvious commitment to using his position constructively. After the formal remarks, the reception took on a more relaxed atmosphere. Guests gathered in smaller groups, conversations became more personal, and the palace staff circulated with more elaborate refreshments. Steinmeier noticed that King Charles had positioned himself near a fountain where he could easily move between different groups while maintaining conversations with key leaders. The German president found himself in an extended conversation with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, about the role of religious institutions in addressing social inequality. The Archbishop's perspectives on poverty and social justice aligned closely with Steinmeier's own views, developed during his years studying law and working in social democratic politics. "The Church has always had a role in speaking truth to power," Archbishop Welby observed. "In our time, that means addressing economic systems that leave too many people behind." Their discussion was overheard by several other guests, including the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who added her own observations about the European Union's social policies. Soon, a larger group had formed, discussing everything from minimum wage policies to healthcare access across European nations. As midnight approached, the reception began to wind down. Guests started making their departures, but the conversations continued even as people said their goodbyes. Business cards were exchanged, follow-up meetings were arranged, and informal agreements were reached on various initiatives. King Charles made a point of speaking privately with each head of state before their departure. When he reached Steinmeier, the conversation picked up where their earlier discussion had ended. "I hope tonight has been productive for you," the king said. "I sensed real enthusiasm for closer cooperation on environmental issues." "Very productive, Your Majesty. I think we've laid the groundwork for some significant initiatives." Steinmeier paused, then added, "Your approach to diplomacy is refreshing. Personal relationships still matter in international affairs." "My mother taught me that," King Charles replied. "She believed that understanding people as individuals was the key to understanding nations. Tonight has convinced me she was right." As Steinmeier prepared to leave, he reflected on the evening's accomplishments. Multiple conversations had planted seeds for future cooperation. New relationships had been formed, and existing ones had been strengthened. The reception had succeeded in its primary goal, establishing King Charles as a leader capable of bringing European nations together around common interests. The drive back to Claridge's took them through London's quiet midnight streets. The city looked different in the darkness, more mysterious and timeless. Streetlights illuminated empty sidewalks where millions of people would walk the next morning, pursuing their individual dreams while remaining largely unaware of the diplomatic conversations that shaped their future. In his hotel suite, Steinmeier debriefed with his staff about the evening's conversations and their potential implications. Notes were taken, follow-up actions were identified, and preliminary reports were drafted for transmission to Berlin. The formal work of diplomacy would continue for weeks as the promises made in palace gardens were translated into concrete policies and programs. But as he finally prepared for bed, Steinmeier's thoughts returned to his personal impressions of King Charles and the evening's atmosphere. Something significant had happened at the reception, something that transcended the specific agreements and understandings reached. A new chapter in European diplomacy had begun, one that emphasized personal relationships and shared values over rigid protocol and narrow national interests. The success of the reception would be measured not just in immediate outcomes, but in its long-term influence on how European leaders approached their common challenges. King Charles had demonstrated that soft diplomacy, the patient building of trust and understanding, remained a powerful force in international relations. For Germany and Britain, the evening marked the beginning of a new partnership that would influence European politics for years to come. The next morning brought unexpected developments that would test the diplomatic relationships formed during the previous evening's reception. Steinmeier was awakened at dawn by his secure phone, its distinctive ringtone indicating an urgent message from Berlin. Klaus Müller entered the suite moments later, carrying a laptop and wearing the expression that always preceded difficult news. "Mr. President, we have a situation developing in Brussels," Klaus reported, opening the laptop to show a news feed. "The European Parliament has called an emergency session regarding new sanctions against Russia. They're requesting immediate input from all member nations, and Britain has offered to coordinate a joint response despite no longer being an EU member." Steinmeier sat up in bed, instantly alert. This was exactly the kind of crisis that could either strengthen the relationships built the previous evening or tear them apart under the pressure of competing national interests. The offer from Britain to coordinate sanctions was particularly significant. It suggested King Charles's reception had accomplished more than anyone had anticipated. "What's the British position?" Steinmeier asked, reaching for his reading glasses. "That's what's interesting," Klaus continued. "Prime Minister Sunak's office called our embassy an hour ago. They want to arrange a working breakfast between you and the Prime Minister before you return to Berlin. The King has apparently given his personal support to closer British-German cooperation on the sanctions issue." The speed of this development surprised even experienced diplomatic observers. Typically, such coordination required weeks of preliminary negotiations and careful positioning by foreign ministries. The fact that it was happening within hours of the reception demonstrated the power of personal diplomacy when conducted at the highest levels. Steinmeier's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Chancellor Olaf Scholz in Berlin. The message was brief but clear. Frank-Walter, take the meeting. This could be the breakthrough we've been seeking with post-Brexit Britain. Keep me informed. Within 2 hours, Steinmeier found himself in the cabinet room at 10 Downing Street, facing Prime Minister Rishi Sunak across the same table where Churchill had planned the D-Day landings and Thatcher had reshaped British conservatism. The symbolism was not lost on either leader as they prepared to discuss measures that could fundamentally alter Europe's relationship with Russia. President Steinmeier, thank you for agreeing to this early meeting, Sunak began, his manner businesslike but warm. The King spoke to me this morning about your conversations yesterday evening. He believes we have an opportunity to demonstrate that Brexit doesn't mean Britain has abandoned its European responsibilities. Steinmeier studied the young Prime Minister, nodding the intelligence in his eyes and the confidence in his bearing. At 43, Sunak represented a new generation of British leadership, one that had grown up with European integration as a fact of life, but now had to navigate Britain's complex relationship with the continent from outside the European Union. Chancellor Scholz has authorized me to explore areas of cooperation, Steinmeier replied. Germany values Britain's intelligence capabilities and its global perspective on security issues. If we can coordinate effectively on sanctions, it sends a powerful message about Western unity. The conversation that followed was remarkably candid for a first substantive meeting between the two leaders. Sunak outlined Britain's intelligence assessment of Russian economic vulnerabilities, while Steinmeier shared Germany's analysis of how new sanctions might affect European energy markets. Both men understood that their discussion could influence policy decisions affecting millions of people across 2 continents. The challenge is timing, Sunak observed, referring to a classified intelligence report. Our sources suggest Russia is preparing to escalate their actions in Ukraine within the next month. If we're going to implement new sanctions, they need to be ready for immediate activation. Germany faces domestic political pressures regarding energy costs, Steinmeier acknowledged. But public support for Ukraine remains strong. If Britain can provide alternative energy sources during the transition period, we can support much stronger sanctions than previously considered. They were interrupted by a secure communication from the Cabinet Office. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen was requesting a 3-way video conference within the hour to discuss the sanctions coordination. The speed at which events were moving reflected the urgency all parties felt about the deteriorating situation in Ukraine. The video conference, conducted from the secure communications room in Downing Street, brought together 3 of Europe's most influential leaders for a discussion that would shape continental policy for months to come. Von der Leyen, speaking from Brussels, outlined the European Union's position on new sanctions while acknowledging the need for British cooperation to make them effective. The sanctions we're discussing would target Russia's remaining energy exports and their access to international financial markets, von der Leyen explained. But without British cooperation, particularly regarding financial institutions in the City of London, the measures would be significantly weakened. Sunak's response was immediate and positive. Britain is prepared to implement parallel sanctions that would effectively close London's financial markets to targeted Russian entities. We can have the legal framework in place within 72 hours. Steinmeier found himself in the unusual position of facilitating cooperation between Britain and the European Union, despite Britain's departure from the organization. His conversations with King Charles the previous evening had apparently created a foundation of trust that was now enabling rapid policy coordination. Germany will support the strongest possible sanctions package, Steinmeier stated. Our industrial sector has developed alternative supply chains that reduce our vulnerability to Russian retaliation. We're prepared to accept short-term economic costs for long-term strategic benefits. The 3 leaders spent the next hour working through technical details of sanctions implementation, coordination mechanisms, and public messaging strategies. It was the kind of detailed policy work that normally required teams of experts and weeks of preparation. But the crisis in Ukraine and the personal relationships established at the royal reception had created conditions for rapid decision-making. As the video conference concluded, Steinmeier realized that King Charles's reception had accomplished something remarkable. By creating an atmosphere of trust and cooperation among European leaders, the king had enabled policy coordination that would have been impossible through normal diplomatic channels. The soft power of monarchy, when skillfully applied, could still influence hard policy decisions. The return flight to Berlin provided Steinmeier with time to reflect on the previous 24 hours and their broader implications. What had begun as a ceremonial reception had evolved into substantive policy coordination that could reshape European responses to international crises. The speed and effectiveness of the process demonstrated the continued importance of personal diplomacy in an age of digital communication and distant decision-making. Klaus Müller, sitting across from him in the presidential aircraft, was already drafting reports for various German government ministries. The Foreign Office needed detailed briefings on British positions regarding sanctions. The Economics Ministry required assessments of how closer cooperation with Britain might affect German trade relationships. The Chancellor's office wanted a complete overview of opportunities for enhanced British-German cooperation. This could be the beginning of a new model for European cooperation, Klaus observed as he worked on his laptop. Britain outside the EU but closely coordinated with major member states on key issues. It's not what anyone originally envisioned, but it might be more effective than formal membership for certain purposes. Steinmeier nodded, but his thoughts had already moved to the challenges ahead. The sanctions coordination was just the beginning. If Britain and Germany could work together effectively on Ukraine, similar cooperation might be possible on climate change, technology regulation, and global health initiatives. The royal reception had opened a door that had been closed since the Brexit referendum. Upon landing in Berlin, Steinmeier was met by a motorcade that took him directly to the Chancellery for briefings with Scholz and other senior officials. The urgency reflected the fact that European sanctions policy was being formulated in real time, with decisions made in London and Berlin having immediate consequences for the war in Ukraine and European economic stability. Chancellor Scholz was waiting in his office, surrounded by advisors from the Foreign Office, Finance Ministry, and Intelligence Services. The contrast between the elegant formality of Buckingham Palace and the functional efficiency of the Chancellery was striking, but both settings served the same fundamental purpose, enabling leaders to make decisions that affected millions of people. "Frank-Walter, tell me about Sunak," Scholz requested immediately. "Can we trust him to follow through on these commitments? The British have been unpredictable since Brexit." "He's serious and well-informed," Steinmeier replied. "More importantly, he has the King's support for closer cooperation with Germany. That provides political cover for policies that might be controversial with Brexit hardliners in his party." The briefing session continued for 2 hours, with Steinmeier providing detailed accounts of his conversations with King Charles, Prime Minister Sunak, and other European leaders at the reception. Intelligence analysts took notes, economists evaluated potential consequences of various policy options, and diplomats prepared communication strategies for other European capitals. Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock joined the meeting via secure video link from New York, where she was attending United Nations sessions. Her perspective on how the British-German cooperation might be perceived by other allies was crucial for ensuring that bilateral coordination didn't undermine broader multilateral relationships. "The French are already asking questions," Baerbock reported. "Macron's people want assurance that we're not creating a special relationship with Britain that excludes other EU members. We need to manage this carefully to avoid jealousy or suspicion." This was a familiar challenge in European diplomacy. Any bilateral cooperation between major powers risked being seen as an attempt to dominate decision-making or exclude other important voices. The success of British-German coordination would depend partly on how well it could be integrated into broader European frameworks. As the day progressed, reports began arriving from intelligence services about Russian reactions to the emerging sanctions coordination. Moscow had apparently been caught off guard by the speed and scope of the British-German cooperation. Russian media was describing it as evidence that Brexit had failed to weaken European unity, exactly the opposite of what Putin had hoped to achieve. By evening, Steinmeier was back in Bellevue Palace, reviewing the day's developments with his personal staff. The presidential residence, with its classical architecture and peaceful gardens, provided a stark contrast to the urgent policy discussions that had dominated his London visit. But even in this serene environment, the consequences of the royal reception continued to unfold. His secure phone rang with calls from other European leaders seeking information about the British-German coordination. President Macron wanted assurance that France would be included in future discussions. Prime Minister Meloni offered Italian support for the sanctions, but requested advance notice of major policy announcements. The President of Poland emphasized the importance of maintaining pressure on Russia regardless of economic costs. Each conversation reinforced Steinmeier's understanding that the royal reception had catalyzed changes extending far beyond the immediate sanctions issue. King Charles had succeeded in creating momentum for European cooperation that was now taking on a life of its own. The challenge would be managing that momentum constructively while avoiding the political complications that could arise from rapid policy changes. Late that evening, Steinmeier received a personal message from King Charles, transmitted through encrypted diplomatic channels. The king expressed satisfaction with the day's developments and suggested that similar receptions might be held quarterly to maintain the cooperative atmosphere among European leaders. The message concluded with an invitation for Steinmeier and his wife to visit the royal estate at Balmoral during the summer for more extended discussions about environmental cooperation. As Steinmeier prepared for bed, he reflected on how a single evening at Buckingham Palace had evolved into a new model for European diplomacy. The traditional mechanisms of multilateral cooperation, summit meetings, formal negotiations, lengthy diplomatic processes, remained important. But the royal reception had demonstrated that personal relationships and informal settings could accelerate policy coordination in ways that formal processes often could not achieve. The ultimate test of this new approach would come in the following weeks, as the sanctions were implemented and their effectiveness evaluated. If British-German cooperation proved successful in pressuring Russia, similar partnerships might emerge on other global challenges. If it failed, or if it created political problems within Europe, the experiment might end as quickly as it had begun. But for now, the reception's success was clear. Two nations that had been struggling to define their post-Brexit relationship had found a path toward renewed cooperation. A new king had demonstrated his ability to influence international affairs through skilled personal diplomacy, and European unity had been strengthened at a moment when it was desperately needed to address an ongoing crisis that threatened the continent's security and values. 3 weeks after the royal reception, Steinmeier found himself facing the most significant diplomatic crisis of his presidency. The sanctions package coordinated with Britain had been successfully implemented, but Russia's response had been swift and brutal. Moscow had completely cut off natural gas supplies to Germany and launched a devastating cyber attack on British financial institutions. The cooperation born at King Charles's reception was now being tested under the harshest possible circumstances. The emergency meeting convened at Bellevue Palace brought together Germany's most senior security officials. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius sat alongside Intelligence Chief Bruno Kahl, while Chancellor Scholz participated via secure video link from the Chancellery. The atmosphere was tense as they reviewed overnight intelligence reports detailing the scope of Russian retaliation. The cyber attack on London's financial district is more sophisticated than anything we've seen before, Kahl reported, his usually calm demeanor showing signs of strain. They've targeted transaction systems, backup networks, and even the physical infrastructure of data centers. The British estimate it could take weeks to fully restore normal operations. Steinmeier absorbed this information while studying satellite imagery showing Russian military movements along Ukraine's borders. The coordination with Britain had achieved its intended effect. Russia was clearly feeling the pressure of the enhanced sanctions. But Putin's willingness to escalate had exceeded even the most pessimistic intelligence assessments. "What's the British response?" Steinmeier asked. Defense Minister Pistorius consulted his tablet before responding. Prime Minister Sunak has activated Article 5 protocols with NATO regarding the cyber attack. He's also requesting immediate consultation with Germany about joint defensive measures. The king has apparently been in personal contact with other European monarchs to maintain Allied unity. The mention of King Charles reminded Steinmeier of their conversation at the reception about the importance of personal relationships in international affairs. Now those relationships were being tested by circumstances that could either strengthen them permanently or destroy them under pressure. The theoretical cooperation discussed in Palace Gardens was becoming a real-world alliance forged in crisis. Steinmeier's secure phone buzzed with an incoming call from Prime Minister Sunak. The British leader's voice carried strain, but also determination, as he briefed the German president on London's situation and requested coordination on their response to Russia's escalation. President Steinmeier, our financial systems are under unprecedented attack, but our resolve remains firm, Sunak reported. We need Germany's support in demonstrating that Russian aggression will only strengthen Western cooperation, not weaken it. You have our full support, Prime Minister, Steinmeier replied immediately. Chancellor Scholz has authorized me to coordinate our response with yours. What do you need from Germany? Intelligence sharing on Russian cyber capabilities, coordination of our diplomatic messaging, and joint planning for additional sanctions if Russia continues to escalate. We also need your help managing European Union reactions to prevent panic or division among our allies. The call lasted 30 minutes, covering everything from technical cybersecurity cooperation to broader strategic coordination. By its conclusion, Steinmeier understood that the crisis had moved far beyond the original sanctions issue. Russia was attempting to break apart the cooperation that had emerged from the royal reception by demonstrating the costs of challenging Moscow's interests. Within hours, Steinmeier was aboard a German Air Force aircraft bound for London for emergency consultations. This time there would be no ceremonial receptions or palace gardens. The meetings would take place in secure government facilities designed for crisis management, but the personal relationships established at Buckingham Palace would prove crucial for rapid decision-making under extreme pressure. The flight provided time to review intelligence assessments and coordinate with other European capitals. President Macron had called to express French solidarity with both Britain and Germany, while also warning about the risks of escalating the confrontation with Russia. Italian Prime Minister Meloni offered support, but emphasized the need for careful consideration of economic consequences across southern Europe. Upon landing at a military airbase outside London, Steinmeier was immediately transported to a secure government facility in the countryside, far from the cyber-vulnerable infrastructure of central London. Prime Minister Sunak was waiting with his senior security team, along with representatives from British intelligence services and the Bank of England. The situation is evolving rapidly, Sunak reported as they gathered around a conference table equipped with secure communications equipment. Russian hackers are now targeting our power grid and transportation systems. This has moved beyond financial warfare to attacks on critical infrastructure. The German delegation included cybersecurity experts from the Federal Office for Information Security, who had been studying Russian capabilities for years. Their assessment was sobering, but offered some hope for effective countermeasures if British and German resources could be properly coordinated. Russian cyber doctrine emphasizes overwhelming initial attacks followed by sustained pressure, explained Dr. Marina Weber, Germany's leading expert on Russian information warfare. They expect Western democracies to panic and demand immediate accommodation. History suggests that unified resistance can discourage escalation more effectively than individual responses. This analysis aligned with intelligence assessments from both British and German services, but implementing coordinated resistance required unprecedented cooperation between nations with different legal systems, operational procedures, and political considerations. The personal trust developed at the royal reception was now enabling rapid decisions that would normally require months of negotiation. The breakthrough came during a secure video conference that included King Charles, speaking from Windsor Castle. The monarch's presence added weight to the discussions while emphasizing the historical importance of British-German cooperation in resisting authoritarian aggression. Prime Minister President Steinmeier, the king began, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. This crisis reminds us why our nations fought together against fascism in the last century. Democratic values require constant defense, and that defense is most effective when shared among allies who trust each other completely. The king's intervention, while carefully avoiding direct policy recommendations, provided political cover for both leaders to take risks that might otherwise have been politically impossible. His reference to historical precedents reminded everyone that British-German cooperation had previously proven decisive in defending European freedom. Over the following hours, a comprehensive response plan emerged from their discussions. Germany would provide cybersecurity expertise and intelligence on Russian operations, while Britain would lead coordination with NATO allies and other English-speaking intelligence partners. Both nations would implement additional economic sanctions targeting Russian technology sectors, and they would coordinate their diplomatic messaging to prevent Moscow from exploiting divisions among Western allies. The plan's implementation required constant communication between London and Berlin, testing the personal relationships and institutional connections that had been established at the royal reception. Steinmeier found himself speaking with British officials multiple times each day, while German cybersecurity experts worked around the clock with their British counterparts to defend against ongoing Russian attacks. The crisis reached its climax when Russian forces launched a major offensive in Ukraine, clearly timed to coincide with the cyber attacks on Western infrastructure. The coordination between military aggression and cyber warfare represented a new form of hybrid conflict that challenged traditional defensive strategies and alliance structures. Steinmeier was in the Chancellery Situation Room when reports of the offensive began arriving. Chancellor Scholz had convened Germany's Security Cabinet for emergency consultations, while maintaining constant contact with Allied leaders including Prime Minister Sunak and President Biden. The decisions made in the next few hours could determine whether Ukraine survived as an independent nation. "The Russians are testing whether our cooperation will hold under maximum pressure," Scholz observed, studying real-time intelligence reports from multiple sources. "If they can break our coordination now, they'll have demonstrated that Western unity is fragile and temporary." The challenge was coordinating effective assistance to Ukraine while managing the cyber attacks on British and German infrastructure. Resources were stretched thin, public anxiety was rising, and political pressure for accommodation with Russia was growing among some European leaders who feared economic catastrophe. Steinmeier's phone rang with an encrypted call from King Charles, who was coordinating with other European monarchs to maintain Allied unity. Queen Margaret of Denmark, King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands, and King Felipe of Spain had all committed to supporting continued resistance to Russian aggression, providing political cover for their governments to maintain pressure despite domestic concerns. President Steinmeier, "The monarchs of Europe are united in supporting democratic resistance to Putin's aggression," the king reported. "We remember what appeasement accomplished in the 1930s, and we will not repeat those mistakes regardless of short-term costs." This royal coordination, unprecedented in modern European history, provided a moral framework for continued resistance that transcended normal political calculations. The symbolic power of monarchy, so evident at the reception just weeks earlier, was now being deployed to defend the democratic values that had emerged from the ruins of the Second World War. The turning point came when German and British cybersecurity teams, working in unprecedented coordination, successfully traced the source of Russian cyber attacks and launched targeted counter-operations that disrupted Moscow's capabilities. The technical achievement was remarkable, but equally important was the demonstration that rapid Allied cooperation could overcome sophisticated threats when based on genuine trust and shared commitment. Within 72 hours of the crisis beginning, Russian cyber attacks had been largely neutralized. Additional sanctions were strangling Moscow's technology imports, and Ukrainian forces had successfully repelled the Russian offensive with enhanced Western support. The coordination that had begun with conversations in palace gardens had evolved into an effective alliance capable of defending European security under extreme pressure. The immediate crisis passed, but its implications would shape European security arrangements for years to come. The royal reception had created personal relationships that enabled rapid cooperation under pressure, demonstrating that informal diplomacy could complement formal alliance structures in ways that strengthened overall security. In the weeks that followed, military and intelligence officials from across Europe visited Berlin and London to study the crisis response and develop procedures for similar coordination in future emergencies. The British-German model became a template for enhanced cooperation among allies who maintained different formal relationships with various international organizations. Steinmeier's role in facilitating this cooperation enhanced Germany's position as a bridge between different European institutions and strengthened his own influence in international affairs. The crisis had tested his diplomatic skills under extreme pressure and demonstrated that personal relationships, carefully cultivated, could enable policy coordination that formal negotiations might never achieve. The success also vindicated King Charles's approach to diplomatic engagement, proving that constitutional monarchy could still play a constructive role in international affairs when skillfully applied to contemporary challenges. The reception that had seemed like ceremonial pageantry had actually created the foundation for effective crisis management and enhanced security cooperation. As the immediate danger receded and normal diplomatic processes resumed, Steinmeier reflected on the lessons learned from the experience. Traditional alliance structures remained essential, but they could be strengthened and accelerated through personal relationships and informal cooperation mechanisms. The royal reception had demonstrated how soft power and personal diplomacy could enhance hard security capabilities when applied with skill and commitment to shared values. The crisis had also revealed the importance of sustained engagement rather than episodic cooperation. The relationships formed at the reception required constant attention and regular communication to remain effective under pressure. This understanding would influence how European leaders approached future diplomatic coordination and crisis management. Most importantly, the experience had shown that democracy's greatest strength, the ability of free peoples to cooperate voluntarily in defense of shared values, remained relevant in confronting 21st-century authoritarian challenges. The reception had celebrated those values in elegant surroundings, but the crisis had tested them under fire and proven their enduring power to inspire effective resistance to aggression. 6 months after the royal reception, Steinmeier stood once again in the gardens of Buckingham Palace, but this time the atmosphere was markedly different. The emergency that had tested the cooperation born from King Charles's diplomatic initiative had passed, but its consequences continued to reshape European politics in ways that no one had anticipated. The summer reception, planned as a follow-up to the successful winter gathering, was drawing leaders who now understood that personal diplomacy could produce results that formal negotiations often could not achieve. The guest list for this second reception reflected the changed political landscape. Ukrainian President Zelensky attended as a full participant rather than a symbol of European solidarity, his nation having successfully defended itself with unprecedented allied coordination. Several African leaders were present, representing countries that had aligned with European positions on Ukraine after extensive diplomatic engagement. Most significantly, representatives from China and India had accepted invitations, signaling that King Charles's diplomatic approach was gaining recognition as a serious forum for international engagement. Steinmeier arrived at the palace with a deep sense of satisfaction about the developments that had followed the winter reception. The crisis management that had emerged from those initial conversations had evolved into permanent institutions for enhanced cooperation. A British-German cybersecurity center operated facilities in both London and Berlin, while joint intelligence sharing had expanded to cover global threats far beyond the original Russia sanctions. The personal relationships forged in palace gardens had produced concrete benefits for both nations and their allies. As he entered the familiar gardens, now brilliant with summer flowers and longer daylight, Steinmeier was struck by how comfortable the setting had become. The formal protocol remained, but there was an underlying sense of familiarity among the European leaders who had participated in the winter reception and the crisis management that followed. They had tested each other under pressure and found reliable partners for future challenges. King Charles approached Steinmeier with evident pleasure, their greeting warmer than the courteous formality of their first meeting. The king had gained confidence in his diplomatic role over the past months, and his success in facilitating effective cooperation had enhanced his standing among European leaders who might have been skeptical about monarchy's relevance to contemporary international affairs. "President Steinmeier, welcome back to Buckingham Palace," the king said, his satisfaction evident. "I hope you'll agree that our experiment in personal diplomacy has exceeded expectations." "Your Majesty, the results have been remarkable," Steinmeier replied. "The cooperation that began here has enhanced security for all our nations. More importantly, it has demonstrated that democratic values remain powerful enough to inspire effective collective action. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of President Macron, who had become an enthusiastic supporter of the royal reception format after initially expressing skepticism about bilateral British-German cooperation. The French president's presence had helped address concerns among other European Union members that the reception was creating exclusive partnerships rather than strengthening broader allied relationships. "Your Majesty, President Steinmeier," Macron said as he joined their conversation, "I wanted to personally thank you for including France in the coordination mechanisms that emerged from your winter discussions. The intelligence sharing has been invaluable for our African operations." The reference to African operations highlighted one of the unexpected consequences of the enhanced European cooperation. The rapid response capabilities developed during the Russia crisis had been successfully applied to other security challenges, including terrorist threats in North Africa and cyber attacks originating from various authoritarian regimes. The model of personal relationships enabling institutional cooperation was proving applicable far beyond its original context. As the evening progressed, Steinmeier found himself in conversation with Crown Princess Victoria of Sweden, who was representing her father at the reception. Their discussion about Nordic security arrangements revealed how the British-German cooperation model was being adapted by other European nations facing similar challenges from Russian aggression and hybrid warfare. "The personal relationships are crucial," Crown Princess Victoria observed. "When crisis hits, there's no time for formal introductions and trust-building exercises. Leaders need to know they can rely on each other immediately." This insight resonated with Steinmeier's own experience during the cyber crisis. The speed with which he and Prime Minister Sunak had been able to coordinate their response had depended entirely on the foundation of trust established during their first meeting at the palace. Formal alliance structures provided the legal framework for cooperation, but personal relationships determined how quickly and effectively that cooperation could be implemented. The evening's most significant moment came during King Charles's remarks to the assembled guests. Standing beneath the same oak trees where he had spoken about European cooperation 6 months earlier, the king announced the establishment of a new annual forum for informal diplomatic engagement, to be held alternately in London and other European capitals. "The success of our cooperation over the past months has convinced me that regular personal engagement among democratic leaders strengthens our ability to defend shared values," the king said. "This reception will become an annual tradition, hosted by different nations, but maintaining the same commitment to honest dialogue and mutual understanding." The announcement was received with enthusiasm by the assembled leaders, many of whom had come to appreciate the effectiveness of informal diplomatic engagement. The formal structures of international cooperation, summit meetings, treaty negotiations, multilateral conferences, would remain important, but the royal receptions provided a complementary mechanism for building the personal relationships that made formal cooperation more effective. Steinmeier's conversation with Chinese Ambassador Liu Xiaoming later in the evening revealed another dimension of the reception's growing influence. Beijing had initially dismissed the British-German cooperation as a temporary response to specific circumstances, but the sustained effectiveness of their coordination had prompted Chinese leadership to seek better understanding of European diplomatic methods. President Steinmeier, "Beijing is interested in exploring similar informal engagement with European leaders," Ambassador Liu explained. "We believe personal relationships could help manage tensions that formal diplomatic channels sometimes cannot address effectively." This Chinese interest represented both an opportunity and a challenge for European leaders. Enhanced engagement with China could help manage global tensions and address shared challenges like climate change and economic stability. But it also risked legitimizing authoritarian approaches to international relations or undermining pressure for democratic reforms within China itself. The conversation highlighted the broader implications of the royal reception's success. Personal diplomacy was a powerful tool that could be used by any leader willing to invest time and effort in building relationships. The challenge for democratic leaders was ensuring that their diplomatic engagement served democratic values rather than simply enhancing the effectiveness of international cooperation, without regard to the political systems involved. As midnight approached, and the reception began to wind down, Steinmeier found himself reflecting on the transformation that had occurred since the winter gathering. What had begun as an experiment in personal diplomacy had evolved into a new model for international engagement that was influencing global politics far beyond its European origins. The success had not come without costs. The intense cooperation required constant attention from senior officials, straining resources and sometimes conflicting with other diplomatic priorities. The personal relationships that enabled rapid crisis response also created expectations for continued engagement that could be difficult to maintain over time. But the benefits had far exceeded the costs. European unity had been strengthened at a crucial moment. Effective resistance to authoritarian aggression had been maintained despite serious challenges, and new models for international cooperation had been developed that could address future crises more effectively than previous approaches. King Charles's final private conversation with Steinmeier before the German president's departure summarized the evening's significance and its implications for future diplomatic engagement. President Steinmeier, we've proven that personal relationships remain central to effective international cooperation, the king observed. The challenge now is institutionalizing these relationships in ways that survive changes of government and shifts in political circumstances. Your Majesty, the institutions we've created are already showing resilience, Steinmeier replied. The cybersecurity cooperation continues despite personnel changes in both our governments. The intelligence sharing has become routine rather than crisis-driven. These are encouraging signs for the long-term sustainability of our cooperation. As Steinmeier prepared to leave London the next morning, he carried with him a deep sense of accomplishment about what had been achieved through the royal reception format. But he also understood that the real test of their diplomatic innovation lay ahead. The personal relationships and institutional cooperation that had emerged from Palace Gardens would need to prove their effectiveness across multiple political cycles and changing international circumstances. The flight back to Berlin provided time to consider the broader lessons of the past 6 months. Personal diplomacy remained as important in the 21st century as it had been in previous eras, but it required adaptation to contemporary challenges and integration with modern communication technologies and institutional structures. The royal receptions had demonstrated that soft power, the ability to influence through attraction and persuasion rather than coercion, remained a crucial tool for democratic nations. King Charles's skillful use of monarchy's symbolic authority had created space for honest dialogue among leaders who might otherwise have been constrained by domestic political calculations. Most importantly, the experience had shown that democratic values retain their power to inspire effective cooperation among nations willing to defend them. The elegant surroundings of Buckingham Palace had provided the setting, but the substance had come from leaders who understood that their individual national interests were best served through collective action in defense of shared principles. Upon returning to Berlin, Steinmeier was immediately briefed on preparations for hosting the next royal reception at Bellevue Palace the following year. The German government had enthusiastically accepted the opportunity to continue the diplomatic innovation that had proven so effective in strengthening European cooperation and enhancing international security. The planning process revealed how thoroughly the royal reception model was being integrated into normal diplomatic practice. Foreign ministries were coordinating guest lists, intelligence services were preparing security arrangements, and cultural institutions were developing programs to showcase national achievements and values. What had begun as an experimental approach to personal diplomacy was becoming a standard tool for international engagement. As Steinmeier reviewed the initial plans for the Berlin reception, he understood that the success at Buckingham Palace had created both opportunities and obligations. The relationships forged in Palace Gardens now required constant cultivation through regular communication, joint initiatives, and shared responses to emerging challenges. The legacy of King Charles's reception would ultimately be measured not by the elegance of its execution or the prominence of its guest list, but by the sustained cooperation it enabled among democratic nations facing authoritarian challenges. The personal relationships established over champagne and conversation in royal gardens had evolved into institutional partnerships capable of defending European security and promoting democratic values around the world. The transformation from ceremonial pageantry to substantive policy coordination demonstrated that traditional diplomatic tools retain their relevance when skillfully adapted to contemporary circumstances. The ancient art of personal diplomacy, practiced in the historic setting of Buckingham Palace, had produced thoroughly modern solutions to 21st-century challenges. Steinmeier's experience had convinced him that the future of international cooperation depended on combining formal institutional structures with informal personal relationships. The royal reception provided a model that other democratic nations could adapt to their own circumstances and traditions, creating a global network of personal diplomatic engagement that could respond effectively to authoritarian challenges while maintaining democratic values and principles. The Garden Party that had seemed like an elegant anachronism had proven to be a diplomatic innovation with profound implications for international relations. King Charles's investment in personal relationships had yielded strategic benefits that formal negotiations alone could never have achieved, demonstrating once again that in diplomacy, as in life, personal connections remain the foundation of all meaningful cooperation.